As we think about our supply chains in 2022, it's time to rethink our strategies and rethink our approaches. So what I want to talk about today are what are those top 10 trends and strategies that we need to be aware of and we need to be considering as part of our supply chain strategies for 2022. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital and business transformation journeys. And as we enter 2022, we have to be thinking about how our supply chains have worked in the past and be thinking about how we're going to adjust those supply chains to work better in the future. And it all starts with rethinking our objectives with our supply chains. In the past, prior to the pandemic, most supply chains were focused on cost optimization and throughput. How can we get the lowest cost provider? How can we get as much through the supply chain as quickly as possible? We weren't thinking about things like flexibility, or what if there's a pandemic that hits the world, or what if customer demand shifts dramatically overnight. Those weren't things we were really thinking about. They weren't top of mind for us up until 2020. So now as we enter 2022, we've got 1.5 to 2 years of experience dealing with this post-pandemic world. We have a couple years of experience of dealing with broken supply chains, and now it's time to rethink those strategies and really look at the ways that we can improve our supply chains going forward. Labor shortages throughout the world are one of the key challenges that supply chains are facing. It's something that's limiting the reliability and the flexibility of our supply chains, and it's creating a lot of disruption. It's undermining our customer experience and making our lives difficult in the meantime. So one of the best ways that we can address this labor shortage is via human capital management and rethinking our human capital management strategies. So in other words, how can we better attract and retain talent in light of the fact that it's so hard to find and retain good talent? How can we ensure that we develop those resources to become better at supporting our supply chain? And ultimately, how can we ensure that we keep those resources as part of our team and as one of our employees for the longer term? Now, this can't all be fixed with technology, but there is HR technology out there, such as human capital management systems that can help automate some of the hire to retire processes and create a certain amount of employee stickiness with our organizations. And that can be a great way to start, is to deploy human capital and HR technologies that help automate some of our HR, our recruiting, our development, our learning and our training processes, and all of the functions that support the overall employee experience. So supply chains of the future, the most successful ones, are going to be better at human capital management than those that aren't. Given the unpredictable demand and the unpredictable impacts that suppliers are having on overall supply chains, it's more important than ever that we have visibility into the overall supply chain. So we have to understand what's happening from the point of customer demand through the procurement of raw materials, through the procurement of semi-finished goods or components that go into our finished goods, through the manufacturing process, warehouse processes, logistics, shipping, 3PLs, getting the products to our end customers, and ultimately repeating that cycle over again. And a lot of organizations just weren't prepared for the unpredictability of today's day and age, so they didn't have the technologies and the processes to support those types of needs that we had within our supply chains. So we need to have better processes and better technologies to provide that visibility within our supply chain. And it's not just our immediate suppliers and customers we need to think about. In some cases, depending on your business, you may need to think about your second and third tier suppliers. What is their reliability? What is their quality? What is their availability? What is their lead time? The further we can go down and into the supply chain, the more effective we're going to be at planning our supply chain. Same with our customers. If our customers have customers they're selling to, it's even better if we can anticipate the end customer demand, even if we're not selling directly to the end customers. So that's another way that we can sort of extend that visibility via our processes and technologies and data to ensure that we're looking at the entire supply chain. And we also want to look at things like visibility into other players within our supply chains, in addition to our direct suppliers. You have 3PLs or logistic providers. You might have ports that you're relying on or shipping providers. People that are critical to the execution of your supply chain, you want to make sure you have visibility into their reliability, their cost, their predictability, and all those things that are important to an effective supply chain. So one of the most important trends and strategies for 2022 is to have this visibility into the entire supply chain. pandemic first hit in early 2020 and all the lockdowns ensued after that, a lot of supply chains learned very quickly the hard way that they had concentrated their risk with a small number of suppliers. It may be that they relied on one key supplier for one key component or key raw material for their supply chain, and that one provider was in a country that was completely locked down or couldn't produce for whatever reason that core component. So they found that they didn't have the diversity of suppliers and they hadn't diversified their risk enough to sustain a supply chain to navigate some of these challenges and curveballs that we've experienced in the last couple of years. So organizations going forward need to really think about how they diversify their supplier base. Ensure that you have your plan B, your plan C, your backup vendors in case one vendor can't perform or can't come through for you. Or it may be that you just want to diversify and hedge your risk to begin with and procure from multiple suppliers. And that certainly might reduce your purchasing power with any one given supplier, but you might be willing to give up some of that cost optimization in the name of having more flexibility and more dependency and reliability within your supply chain. So that diversity of your supplier base is critical, not just for where you're procuring raw materials and components from, but also the types of 3PL providers you might rely on, the ports that you're receiving product from. Do we need to have other ports that we can rely on in case one port experiences a bottleneck, as many are throughout the world? So that diversification of our supplier base and diversification of the different points of our supply chain is critical to success in the 2020s. Another thing that the post-pandemic world of the 2020s is teaching us is that many organizations have overly complex and over-engineered products and raw materials. It may be that the products themselves don't lend themselves to a streamlined supply chain. So if you have a product that requires thousands of different raw materials to complete your product, we may want to look at ways that you can streamline that from a product development perspective and also from a supplier perspective to ensure that you're not so dependent on so many different suppliers. Oftentimes, when you have that many raw materials, you're just increasing the odds of something going wrong in the supply chain. So if we can streamline and simplify our supply chain, that can oftentimes mitigate that risk. Supply chains in general struggle to have a clear visibility into their cost structure, their landed cost structure, even before the pandemic. And certainly now in the 2020s, that's becoming even more difficult because of inflation, because of supplier breakdowns and bottlenecks within the supply chain. That's creating a number of challenges that makes it difficult to see what the real cost structure is. What is the real landed cost of our procured and manufactured materials? So in order to overcome this, we need to make sure that we have a solid understanding of what that cost structure really is. What are the labor costs that go into it? What are our direct costs? What are our shipping costs, our 3PL costs, our freight costs? All that stuff that goes into the supply chain, we want to break it down and understand at a unit level how those costs equate to a total landed cost for any given product. And that's going to help us battle inflation. It's going to help us make sure that we're holding our margins steady in the current environment of inflation and other price fluctuations. So that cost transparency is something that's very critical, and it may be that having better systems and better technologies is one way to do that. As organizations have extended lead times, as they've diversified their supplier base, as they have in some cases entered into new partnerships and new agreements with new suppliers, that has created a cash constraint for some organizations. It's caused more cash to be consumed and tied up in your supply chain in a way that wasn't the case a couple of years ago. So now organizations, to be effective in their supply chain management, need to make sure that they have enough cash liquidity to ensure that they can finance and support these strains on cash flow that supply chain issues are creating right now. So this is more of a Band-Aid fix. It's more of a reaction to the challenges that organizations are currently facing. But organizations that are stronger financially and on more solid footing, have access to credit, have a line of credit they can draw from, that's going to be a good way to mitigate some of the challenges that come from having new suppliers that have more stringent payment terms, for example, or the fact that you're not going to get paid from your customers until later because it's going to take you longer to get the raw materials to be able to produce it and ultimately get your products to your customers. So that extension of the overall duration and the overall supply chain delivery is creating more cash constraints that the more financially sound organizations are going to be able to navigate more effectively. Now, the last two strategies and trends I've talked about are related to financial considerations, one related to cost and the other one related to cash liquidity. On top of that, a third financial consideration is your overall pricing strategy. Once you understand your overall landed cost and your per unit cost to include your supply chain cost, once you understand the liquidity and the cash implications of your supply chain management, now we can revisit our pricing models and ensure that we have the right price structure to account for some of those considerations, as well as other inflationary pressures, currency fluctuations, and other things that are going to affect our supply chain. So a prerequisite to having the right pricing strategies is a lot of the other stuff I've already talked about, but ultimately you want to take that information that you've gathered, those processes you've put in place, and those new technologies and data points that you've put in your supply chain to ensure that you have the right pricing structure in place as well. Now, the first 7 things we've talked about can all be enabled in some way by better technologies, better visibility into information, better tracking of your supply chain, and just overall business intelligence, better business intelligence for your supply chain. So organizations going forward need to rethink their digital strategies because the digital strategies of pre-2020 were no longer relevant to where we are today. So we need to make sure that we have a digital strategy that's right-sized for the 2020s, that takes into account the realities of today, so that we can take all these factors into consideration and that we have a technology roadmap that allows us to accomplish those strategies and trends that I've talked about so far in this list. Now, part of this is looking at the software applications that can automate your supply chain or provide some of that visibility. But it also relates to your data. How do you capture data? What's the business intelligence that you're getting from your systems? Are there other technologies outside of software and enterprise applications that can help automate and improve your supply chain? Things like robotic process automation or robotics in general, smart sensors on your factory floors, things that will help provide more real-time visibility into what's happening. So you want to take a holistic view of your entire digital strategy, look at what you have today that's working well, and look at things you could be improving in the 2020s to make your supply chain more right-sized for the realities of today. Now, something I alluded to in passing earlier in this discussion is the fact that we need to look outside of our immediate supply chain. We have our raw material suppliers all the way through our customers and everything in between. That stuff's all important. We need to get a handle on that. We need to have the right processes and technologies and data and organizational structure to support that supply chain and provide that flexibility for the future. We also need to look outside the supply chain. We need to look at those end customers, like I mentioned before. We need to look at the second and third tier suppliers, those suppliers that may not be immediate suppliers to us, but they affect our immediate suppliers. And the better visibility and the better we can reach out into the other parts or outside the supply chain, the better visibility we're going to have and the better we're going to be able to plan and predict and be effective in managing the overall supply chain. So it's important to not only look at your immediate supply chain and those immediate stakeholders and touch points that you're used to working with, but also the touch points and stakeholders outside of your supply chain as well. Whether we like it or not, or want it to happen or not, chances are fairly high that there will be some sort of government regulations as it relates to the supply chain. At the time I'm recording this video, for example, the United States government is already talking about and exploring the idea of imposing regulations and taking a more active role in managing global supply chains as a way to try and fix the problem. And again, doesn't matter what your political beliefs are, whether you think this is a good idea or not, the reality is it's likely to happen. So we need to make sure that we have a supply chain structure and processes and systems in place that gives us the flexibility to be able to adapt if or when those government regulations come into play. And one thing about government regulations is they oftentimes aren't realistic, oftentimes they're painful, and oftentimes they don't give you a lot of time to really plan and prepare for it. So if you can start planning and preparing for potential regulations now, that's going to make your life a lot easier if it were to happen in the future. Worst case scenario, if the government regulations never happen, or if this all passes and supply chains somehow get back to normal, at the very least, hopefully you've built some flexibility into your supply chain that can respond to other third-party and unpredictable aspects of supply chain management. So prepare for government regulation. Even if the government regulation doesn't happen, you'll be better prepared to manage a successful supply chain in the future. So these are just 10 of the most important strategies that we see as being important for managing supply chains in the 2020s and doing so effectively. I also encourage you to think about some of the digital transformation aspects of how you might automate and improve your supply chain with technology and process and people improvements, And to help you with that assessment and with that journey, I've included a number of resources below that are meant to help you understand best practices around supply chain and digital transformations, independent reviews of technologies that might help you automate and improve your supply chains, and other resources that are meant to help you. So I encourage you to check that out. I've included a number of links below. So I hope you found this information useful. Hope you have a great day.